Hi, everybody. I am Mark Jacobstein, general partner here at Near Horizon. Welcome to the Near Horizon podcasts, where we discuss AI opportunities so close they're on the near horizon. I'm here today with Andrew Pannu, who's an old friend and the founding CEO of Sleuth Insights. Andrew studied economics at UCLA and was then a star analyst at places like Deutsche Bank and Pharma, which is a subsidiary of Apollo Global, a large global hedge fund. Before we crossed paths at Imuni, worked together doing single-cell genomics with machine learning to unpack the great mysteries of the immune system. We had a wonderful time working together, and I was really excited when a few years later, as we were putting Near Horizon together, Andrew and I had the opportunity to work together on his business, Sleuth Insights, and making that a reality. So maybe one of the things I'd like to start with, Andrew, tell our audience about Sleuth and what you're building and why.
Awesome. Yeah, no, Mark, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. My easy one-liner with Sleuth is we're done for you AI-enabled competitive intelligence for BioPharma. So that's generally going to be BD team, search and evaluation, portfolio management. The way I think about it is biotech is so much more faster and global than it's ever been. It's not just enough to be watching your immediate competitors. You have to also now increasingly watch China and Asia and these antibody shops coming out of that region, smaller biotech, stealth companies. There's regulatory changes to track. And it adds up to just a massive amount of information that is kind of changing every single day. So the companies we work with, they don't have the operating system to be able to track and synthesize all of that data at the speed that they need to move in today's world. And when I talk to these executives and these leaders, they know that for the most part, when they're making these decisions, everyone else has maybe looked at that same deal, or everyone else has thought about, should we pivot to that indication of TA? And they have to believe that the reason that they're doing that is that right now maybe they have smarter people, or maybe there's some company-specific synergies. But in this new AI world, that alpha can actually be better data connectivity, better intelligence. Can we find something no one else found because we have all the systems in place?
So maybe to paraphrase, what's happening is in the world of biotech, there's just more and more things happening. More drug programs from more companies in more parts of the world. Yep. And an analyst's job is to understand what's happening and allow their company to skate to where the puck is going to be, or to allow their company to make an investment based on what they think is likely to happen in the future in regards to new drugs that are developed or what's happening along those lines. And your thesis is that no human can kind of keep up with all of this, and that building ML-powered systems to help with that work is going to make analysts better at their job.
Definitely. That's a great summary.
So tell me, sir, how'd you get there? I mean, this is, it seems like an important insight. My sense is that maybe this fell out of the work that you were doing yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. I feel like, I tell people this, I feel like I lived this role over and over again. And while the company might have been different and the position, the industry might have been different. I, started at the sell side, then moved to the buy side, then was actually at an innovative biotech company. There oftentimes was the same job that I was filling, which was, hey, someone needs to go kind of look at all the messy data and make sense of it and kind of come back with the right insights, the right data points that help us tell this story. And if that's a story that supports a decision, whether that's an investment decision or a development decision or a BD decision, or it's a story that you tell to investors or to employees, like that all was variable, but fundamentally that was the job. And so I was using all of the existing tools that were out there, which largely were here's a database and not much else. And after I think the fourth time doing it, I really figured there's probably a company that needs to exist here that can just make this so much easier.
I remember in some of our first conversations, you described that what you were often doing is taking disparate data from a variety of data sources and building bespoke models in Excel. And I was somewhat shocked to hear that. I believed you because it is your job and you're far more expert at this than I was. But it struck me as odd because I've worked in biotech and tech bio, and there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of PhD bioinformaticians, ML professionals, stats professionals who are in the industry. And so I was surprised that at your level of sort of broad industry analyses that these tools didn't exist already. Do you have a sort of a thesis as to why that is and why this opportunity seemed to exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. I think on one hand, the adoption of just better, more sophisticated tooling, AI, we've seen, as at least from a headline level, that happen a lot more at the earliest stage of drug development when you're talking about identifying molecules or like the underlying chemistry and biology and how can we make those really early inefficient processes more efficient. And maybe then through the earliest stages of kind of the development aspect, but even then it starts to taper off a bit more. When you get to the other side of that, where you have teams that are not necessarily focused on, actually building the molecule, but more so just trying to understand the space and like think about external innovation and understand everything else is out there. Those tools just had not reached them. The status quo of kind of just doing it the old-fashioned way, I guess, was always perceived as good enough. I think in one sense, what we're trying to challenge at Sleuth is these conventional notions in the industry about what decision making needs to look like and what that speed looks like, what that quality looks like. What if you could get a complete competitive landscape analysis and a full deck with all the associated data an hour after breaking news happened? Why does that process have to take weeks, if not months, of multiple iterations before you can even get off the ground? How does your relationship with competitive intelligence change when it becomes this competitive advantage where every market movement is an opportunity to get ahead because your team can move just so much faster? And in some sense, that's always been the alpha. That's why there's these really specialized, hedge funds and investing teams that do really well because they just are really good and they work really hard and they have slightly better tooling and they win. And can we bring that to everyone?
It's an interesting insight, and I certainly understand how, say, in the investment banking or hedge fund world, or folks are making instantaneous or near instantaneous investment decisions, speed really matters. I feel like in a biotech and pharma context, the decisions are obviously longer, and the decisions are things like, do we pursue a drug program? Do we increase an indication? Do we buy an asset? Do we sell an asset, et cetera? And those decisions can typically take a scale of months or years as opposed to minutes or hours. So part of what also needs to be happening for this to be valuable for those customers is that you're unlocking things that they just weren't going to see. Do you have some examples of things that maybe Sleuth has found either in your own analyses that you've done or for customers? And obviously you can't tell us anything proprietary, but sort of ideas of things that the platform is able to unpack that is really useful for your biotech or pharma customers?
Yeah, totally. And there's two components to that. So the first is you're totally right that these decisions kind of take place in its final form over some extended duration. But oftentimes there's a million kind of micro steps that go into making that ultimate decision. So there's the initial first order questions that might just be a reaction to to make it concrete. Let's say a competitor goes out and in-licenses an asset in a space in which you're active, and now there needs to be this kicks off this process of okay, what does that mean? Do we now need to refresh our landscape? We need to understand what's going on.
Do we shut down our program? Do we? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that ultimate decision of what are we going to do is kind of so far off. But in order to build up to that, you need to kind of do all the requisite analyses. And it's those requisite analyses that can sometimes delay that decision, or even just it just never happens because you never had enough information to really feel comfortable with it. So I think there's that process as well of making all those micro steps faster is super important. And then to your point on kind of the novel insights, that's ultimately where you get to by going 34 orders of questions deep. I feel like everyone probably when something happens, they have the similar kind of initial reaction, we need to kind of look at this space. But it's the folks who are able to do the work and go really, really deep who then uncover that, no one has seen this thing. And it could be something, and you just put in general terms, something as random as in the appendix of a paper that was published 2 years ago that no one's really paying attention to, or an abstract that dropped that kind of didn't make much waves but super relevant. That has data that actually is quite informative of something that's going to happen maybe for a trial or for an upcoming catalyst. Or from a completely different perspective, it could be you kind of got to the fundamental question that really matters much faster than the industry analysts, than competitors. And because you were a prepared mind much faster, you're able to move much quicker, maybe before anyone even realizes, oh, actually, this is what that means. You're already setting up a BD search process or looking at changing your trial design or something like that. And so that's where all these insights compound. It's not usually in like one shot. And
Right.
I always caution people, it's not like you're just going to turn it on and it's going to find something no one else found, but
Here's the magic answer. It's interesting.
Exactly.
It's sort of compounded improvements in your decision making is an interesting way to sort of think about the ability of the platform. So tell me, as with every startup, Sleuth went through a variety of iterations right from the start, and I know we did an extensive sort of customer discovery process with you right from the start. Talk to me about sort of how the product evolved and the learnings you had as you spoke to your customers over sort of the first year of development.
Yeah. So when you kind of first kicked off, we very much were focused, and probably as a result of my background, on servicing investors and kind of financial professionals in and around the biopharma industry, and finding ways to make them, one, more efficient, but mostly also like, can we help them uncover those insights that are really meaningful and move the needle for them? And no idea really survives first contact with reality in the market, and there's always this like redirection that the market gives you, and so for a variety of reasons, we were pushed more and more towards the actual biopharma companies themselves, which are more numerous.
So your ICP changed really from financial professionals at places like hedge funds to maybe corp dev folk inside of or people who run programs inside of biotech and pharma. And I guess the good news there is that there are at least an order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude more buyers in that space than say in the hedge fund space.
Yeah, absolutely. So from that perspective, it made sense. And then, I mean, from the perspective of like, sometimes what an investor does, they're playing the market, right? And the market is kind of this like totally different beast that's somewhat divorced from the processes of other customers. And that can sometimes involve like, if you're a pod shop hedge fund analyst, you are thinking about things in like maybe days or weeks of timeline so that you can play a stock, and you are very, very cautious about not riding a stock down for any reason, right? And that requires kind of a different set of like analytical thinking that we found was quite unique, actually. Whereas everyone else that was kind of to your point earlier, the long term, the decisions were over more protracted periods, and the results of those decisions were something you lived with for a while. They were all kind of doing a different type of analysis. And in fact, there's many investors, by the way, who do that type of analysis too. They're long term holders, they're long only, or they're biotech specialists that stick with the company from kind of the first time they invest or inception all the way through IPO. And so they also think about things from like, what's best in class, what's differentiated, how's the market thinking about this, what's the broader landscape, how might things move, what does the data show? That was really the questions we always wanted to answer, which is why we got pushed that direction.
Amazing. So Andrew, switching gears here a little bit, one of the things as an investment firm at Near Horizon that works with great entrepreneurs, one of the things we're always looking for is some sort of unfair advantage, right? What do you know that nobody else knows? Do you have a data advantage, a distribution advantage? One of the things that we felt about you is that you had a distribution advantage because you had built up a following on LinkedIn and Twitter and sort of in social media. And you sort of, I would call you like semi-famous or famous biotech analyst. Tell me about sort of how that happened and then the ways that you've been able to leverage that as you've been building the business.
Yeah, I mean, I think initially how it happened was I was at Imuni. I for the first time was working a remote role and wasn't kind of like, in the office with peers all the time, which I'd been used to. I'd moved from New York to California and to be closer to family. And so for a lot of reasons, I felt kind of disconnected from the space. I wasn't senior enough to be invited to go to conferences yet or anything like that. So I remember we were having conversations of like, I kind of want to feel like I should be like talking to people, kind of like growing my network. This is a space I want to, really be in for a long haul. But I feel like I'm just not doing that. And, after maybe a conversation we had, it seemed like, hey, maybe just posting thoughts online and maybe it started as a blog and maybe it was something else. And so that's how it really started. I didn't really expect anything of it. And over time, there was a really positive initial response and I really enjoyed the process actually. And so well before I even thought about, starting a company or anything like that, I was just doing this because I liked it and because I guess I'm a data nerd. And so this stuff is fun for me. And I was enjoying having these conversations and meeting people. And I would schedule all these calls with folks that, previously I would probably never have been able to get in contact with and made some great friends along the way. And so that's all it was for a long time. I think that authenticity actually about it was really important for what came later. And yeah, when we kind of came into starting Sleuth, that was already an engine that was going and certainly continued to invest in it. And over time, showcase how, the product we were building actually made all of those analyses better and faster. And I think what that allowed was, to your point, distribution. It allowed me an entry point to go talk with folks. It's not a guarantee that, they're going to buy your product because they
Right.
like
The product still has to be something that they actually need, that they have budget for, that there's an actual buyer to purchase it. Yeah.
Exactly. But just getting, I think, especially in the early days, I remember when we were, I was talking to Sean, another partner near Horizon, and it was kind of like, okay, what's step one? Step one was like, you need to go talk to like 200 people and figure out what's out there. That was not something I even would have been able to do a year before at all. Like maybe like I would just be another person kind of cold DMing or cold emailing people, and you maybe get some hits here and there, but it just feels like I've been really a quite uphill battle. Now is like, oh, actually, I actually feel like I can do that because I've met a lot of people over the last year, and I continue to kind of get those inbounds because of the content I've been posting. And I can also use that content to drive more conversations organically. And so
I feel like there's so many great entrepreneurial lessons in here, starting with, most of life is just showing up. I mean, I remember you and I, when we worked together at Amy and I, having this conversation about, you're like, I'm really interested in writing these analyses, sort of broad industry analyses. What's happening with the GLP-1 landscape, or which M&As have been successful and why. And I remember just saying to you, so do it. And what was interesting is it turns out, of course, there was a hole in the market, and millions of views later and tens or hundreds of thousands of reposts of your content later, all of a sudden you're internet famous. And it's interesting, it didn't take a decade, right? It sort of happened over the course of a year, maybe two. And it has turned out to be, I think, an incredible asset for you and for Sleuth in terms of outreach to your potential customers. None of it happened. You said something about authenticity in there, and I think none of that would have happened if you weren't actually genuinely interested in the work. I mean, I think for most people to go do the kind of analyses that you did, even if they were bright and possessed sort of the right intellectual tool set, would have been very challenging or painful. And for you, my sense is that this is the stuff that you do for fun. It's part of why Near Horizon was interested in working with you on this problem. Is like we want to find entrepreneurs who are so deeply passionate about something and know far more about it than we ever will. And our goal is to help unlock you and your skills to actually make this sort of passion and this insight into a problem and actually turn that into a company. And that was, I think, part of what worked really well for this combination. So speaking of company building, one of the things that's really interesting about you as a CEO entrepreneur, and the company's doing very well, and we can talk more about that. You don't have a lot of the skills that people think are sort of absolutely necessary for someone to be like a founding CEO of a machine learning driven software company. You don't write code. You're not actually a product person. Before this job, you'd never done business development or sales, right? You were a behind the scenes person doing the analyses that were driving lots of external decisions. And yet, from at least my perspective, you've done like an A+ job of company building, growing into being a fantastic CEO, the company's thriving, et cetera. Talk to me about some of the challenges along the way, your own experiences with growth here, how you think this process is working for you.
Yeah, no, there's so much to say there. So I think this probably wouldn't have been as possible, in a different time. It's just like the right time where, especially, AI has allowed domain experts to really kind of control their own destiny in a sense, and because they deeply understand, what the gap is, and they've lived that over and over, and they know the people, that actually is now turning into some of the more important advantages. So that was, I think, the timing was a huge aspect. And I think from just, my particular journey, there's obviously a ton of, kind of every founder, I'm sure, has a million, this was a really challenging part of my journey or whatever. For me, there were kind of two aspects of the same thing, that one was a bad, one was a good. So on one hand, you're a solo founder, non-technical by nature. There's probably a lot of founder therapy you need, which I'm sure I leaned on you guys to just make sure, hey, you can do this. It's all good. You're going through the same problems that you would have gone through if you went through YC and you had a technical founder and you did all the check the boxes. It's the same thing at the end of the day.
Product market fit turns out to be hard. No matter what,
right? There's no branding or prestige or anything you can kind of slap onto something and people are going to buy your product. You have to go do that hard work, and that's why it's hard. One kind of benefit of that, though, was just I feel like a lot of technical founders are, as a function of being technical, going to fall into like building the product as much as possible because it's very easy to add another feature because and that's what they like to do. Like I like to,
Yeah.
we talked about falling into like kind of your what your nerdy side likes to do, and for those folks maybe opening Excel is terrifying, but for opening like VS Code or Cursor or whatever it is and coding a new feature, the customer kind of haphazardly is like, yeah, maybe if you add this I'd be interested. That feels like the right thing to do. But I mean, it seems like in most cases that's probably not the right thing to do. Like the right thing to do would have been focus more on finding the right demand and thinking about your distribution.
Talk to more customers. And yes, it's lean startup stuff that we've all read, the lean startup, but it's very hard to internalize that just because you can build something doesn't mean you should. And more customer conversations and more insight is really useful because it's much less expensive than actually building the thing and then discovering that nobody wants it.
Yeah, totally. Right. And so for me, not being able to do that actually was kind of like a weird superpower because I had to, it was a forcing function of like, okay, like I don't even have a product in hand. How can I get someone to like maybe say, pre-sell something or like, or, sign an LOI or give me money in advance or something. And those are really hard challenges. But if you kind of approach the hardest stuff first, you actually then, when it comes to, hiring an engineering team and building the product out, you have that initial roadmap and it's actually like, oh, we can just execute against what you already know works, as opposed to like, now we have the team, like, what do we build? Well, we could build anything. That hard part is what do you build? So it was both good and bad, I guess, but it turned out to work out well.
That's a great insight. And I've never thought about that as a in its own way, sort of an entrepreneurial superpower, but it's not that easy for me to build. And so I'm going to be very deliberate. It is probably quite useful. So let me change tacks here just a little bit here. One of the really interesting things about your model, you started out building a piece of software that was designed to be completely self-serve. So you'd hand over sort of an ML-powered tool to somebody who was doing analyses, and they would use this tool to arrive at their own insights. And over time, your model has evolved into a very classic example of what we are now calling like the Swiss or Swiss cheese model, Swiss being services with integrated software, where what you're providing for your customers is a service layer that includes humans and then AI that sits underneath it. And so tell me about that evolution and how that's working for you, why that's working for you, and maybe afterwards I'm going to comment on it because I think it's a really interesting model for, frankly, lots of different vertical applications, including your own.
Yeah, we've said this for years now, and it's trendy now because I guess Palantir is ripping on the public markets, but we always took a lot of inspiration from Palantir, even at the genesis of the company. And what Palantir did that was really exceptional was at the onset, they deployed alongside their customers, deeply understood their workflows, and then designed the systems and software that gave them exceptional value. They did not do it the other way around, which is how most people tend to approach it. And we felt like we should be doing the same thing. I think one portion of this is, every AI company is going to be asked by their investors, whether current or prospective at some point, what is the moat here, right? Like what, especially if you're trying to do knowledge work replacement or knowledge work augmentation, what do you bring to the table that, GPT-5 is not just going to do this, for $20 a month or something. And it's a hard question to answer because we don't know where that development's going to go and all that. But I think one of the better answers that at least I liked was it's very unlikely that a new release of a foundation model is going to understand all of the idiosyncrasies and nuance of an internal company and how they go about making decisions and how the organization is structured and how they like their data and like what format's in one shot. That's going to take some integration and discovery. And if you build your company around that as the ethos of like, we are very tightly interwoven with our customers, which at the onset will take the form of, we'll literally do the work for them so that we can deeply understand it and so that we can build trust and then build that relationship. And then that transitions to, and then we'll build the groundwork for an AI-enabled infrastructure that connects across the entire company and helps bring them into this new world. And you have to earn the right, I think, to do that. And so that's why we approach it.
So tell me about the customer response to this.
I mean, I think like I've learned so much just about how, customers perceive options. And I think, as hard as it is to sell things, I think I actually have more appreciation for how hard it is to buy things, especially when AI is like the buzzword of the day. And perhaps every company is kind of has some internal initiative to see how can they kind of integrate AI into what they do and where can it be useful. If you just even look at the foundation models, this is maybe like a Twitter meme, but you open up ChatGPT and there's like 7 or 8 different models you can pick from with pretty much no delineation between what each does well or not well. And that's one product on one site, let alone the hundreds and hundreds of other companies that promise to, kind of do everything for you.
This is what I do for a living, and it's very, very hard to keep up.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so oftentimes what results out of that is actually just an indecision or a delay or a deferral, because it's just, hey, we don't feel like we have enough, context, understanding about what's even out there in the market to make the right decision, or we'll just stick with what we have because it's kind of working and we'll figure this out later. And that's not a bad decision in most cases.
Yeah.
You have to be able to, or I guess by approaching them and saying like, look, here is the landscape of stuff and here's what we offer. And we're not just like a software tool that you have to go like, there's a learning curve and you have to go learn it. Like we'll literally be doing this stuff for you and really partner and be that strategic partner that actually is thinking about your business just as much as you're thinking about it.
You're often coming in and answering questions that they might have outsourced anyways. Mm-hmm. That they might have gone to a McKinsey or a ZS or an LEK and said, here's a thing we need to understand. And they would have paid $500,000 or $1 million for the answer to that problem, and it would have taken 4 smart people 3 months to work on the thing, and they would come back with an answer. And you're able to do this because of the tooling that you have for less money, much, much faster. And the nice thing is, from a sales perspective, you already fit into a paradigm that they understand. There's already budget. This is something that we're already used to paying for. We are providing answers that we know we need, to questions that we know we need answered. And so it's not a difficult decision. Now, once you're in, then you can start to demonstrate value maybe in areas where I'm going to answer questions that you wouldn't have even bothered to ask in the future. And you can add even more value, and the ability to drive out as much human time and provide as much of this as possible through the ML becomes more and more real as you understand all the questions and you're able to continue to build out your tools. I think it's a very interesting model, as I say, not just for what you've managed to do here in biotech, but for many, many, many different verticals. I think of this as part of the unbundling. You can either think of it as the unbundling of Excel. So anything that people are doing with bespoke models in Excel, probably there's a way to turn this into a much more powerful ML-powered tool. Or differently, maybe the unbundling of McKinsey. And I think that that's also true, that the sort of, what do I hire very, very intelligent, highly paid knowledge workers for to help my company from a decision-making perspective? Well, how much of that can be powered by ML? Not all of it, but some of it. So it's an interesting sort of global trend.
Definitely, yeah.
We talked a little bit about you being a solo founder, and there are challenges to being solo founders. There's advantages to solo founders. You don't have founder conflict, for example, and you get to sort of choose your own fate and control most of the equity and sort of the direction of the company. But there's things that you're missing, of course, and not having true co-founders. Talk to me about that decision. Did you want a co-founder? Sort of how did this evolve? Happy to hear about what that meant vis-a-vis your relationship with Near Horizon.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think almost putting yourself in like that buyer's shoe, right? Like when I was at the very earliest as a founder of trying to found a company, you have all these options of like, do I go join an accelerator? Do I go find a technical co-founder? Like, what are all the options that are available to me? I think Near Horizon definitely presented a innovative, unique option. It would help that we really knew each other, and so it was just like a very natural next step. And in many ways, like that was my co-founding team. Like I didn't, from the first year plus, like, you guys were in the trenches, and that was super useful. In terms of challenges, we touched on one earlier about just like the general, founder therapy aspect, and obviously having a co-founder who kind of
With
is
the shoulder to cry on.
Yeah, the only person who understands what you're going through is extremely useful. So if you don't have that, you have to make sure you build some sort of support network around you. So you're not just trying to shoulder all that burden yourself. You'll go insane. But that, is something that you can, if you're conscious about it, you can set up. The more people you have, the more you feel like you can do. That probably is a mistake, because whether your team is 3 people or 1 person, you can't do very much versus, technically 30,000 or 3,000 or whatever, right? These big companies, you're going to have to let fires burn regardless. With 1 person, it just becomes all you think about is like, I have, 12 hours today to work on this. It's not about filling those 12 hours with how many things can I check off a to-do list. It's about being really thoughtful about what's like the forcing function, what's the number 1 priority. I often think like that's founders need to tell themselves every day when they wake up is like, what is the number 1 priority?
That's the most important thing that a founder chooses to do. What am I choosing to work on today? It's a really interesting perspective. It's sort of the enforced, like, radical discipline of like, what's the one thing I can work on that will actually move the needle? And the question I always try to ask myself is like, what's the difference between success or failure for the company? And if it doesn't meet that threshold, then I can't work on it. I don't work on it. It's the most essential, but also hardest question to ask every day.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And the last thing I'll add is, I do think that one thing that I kind of want to change is like maybe a way of thinking about this is solo at the beginning does not mean that you are solo forever. Right. So just because you are solo from, the first, 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever, like starting a company is like 10-year plus kind of journey. Right. And so the folks who join you in year 2 of a 10-year journey, if you kind of look at it, in retrospect, you're like, they basically were founders. Like the company in year 5 is probably unrecognizable versus the company in year 2. And so even though you at year 2 are sitting here thinking, oh, well, I've been here alone for 2 years or whatever, like it's actually the wrong way to think about it. Like they're just late co-founders, but they're still co-founders.
I love that notion, the late co-founder. And you've built a terrific team, and obviously now you guys are really humming, and that's wonderful. And of course they all have equity stakes. They're different than they would have been if they were sort of original founders. And it allows you the freedom, I think, to like, it's your company. You get to sort of truly run it the way you want to run it. But and there's no sort of possibility of founder conflict given what that looks like. But they feel a great sense of ownership, and to your point, are really going to help drive the company going forward. And it's an interesting mix. And I think for us, one of the things we're seeing is sort of a paradigm shift in terms of how people are starting to think about like, can I do this? It's not on my own, but it's, can I start it on my own and over time build the team around me that I need, and maybe the right team, as I figure out more about language market fit and then product market fit and exactly what I'm going to be building, who the most essential other members of the team will change. And so that's one of the other challenges with, like, if you've got your 2 or 3 or 4 people right from the start, sometimes it turns out that actually it wasn't exactly the right team. And that's that can be very, very painful or challenging or difficult. So let me just a couple more questions here before we run out of time. So what does the world look like 5 years from now if Sleuth really succeeds the way you want it to, in terms of what's happening with the business, but then what is sort of the knock-on effects for the world if Sleuth is the massive success that you hope it is?
Yeah. Look, I think biopharma is probably the single industry where incremental intelligence has the greatest financial and societal ROI. Today, what's driving success or failure is the quality of hundreds of binary decisions. And if you're approaching that with, plus or minus a couple hundred people, and essentially using like encyclopedias to try and like get all the data, legacy databases, Google searches, troving through papers, organizing data in Excel, and so forth, what does that world look like where those companies are operating in a completely different system? They have these, AI teammates that are changing the way knowledge work is done in that space. And we talked about some of that, the speed, right? Like, can you be on a Zoom call with your team and literally be like, oh, it'd be good to get a landscape on that space. And, your Sleuth AI teammate is on the call as well and just starts working on it. And then by the time the call is over, it circulates it to the team. Like, that quality and velocity of decision-making is not something that a lot of people think is possible. But I think if we imagine a world where that is the status quo, it fundamentally changes, I think, the pace and quality of the medicines and the companies that exist.
Our ability to make better therapeutics, better diagnostics, better med devices, and ultimately, as a result, sort of happier, healthier people, tens, hundreds of millions of billions of people around the world, is really driven by these incredibly important R&D decisions that the largest biotech and pharma companies in the world are making. And right now, I guess it sounds like the argument is those decisions, they're not uninformed, but they are not fully informed in the way that they could and should be. And if Sleuth is working, a fully informed decision that happens much more quickly means we are spending R&D dollars better. We're not wasting money, and we're coming up with better therapies and have happier, healthier people.
Yeah, I mean, look, in the limit, I think its health is like going to be where all our money ends up getting spent, right? Like at some point, how many other things do you need that are kind of creature comforts, material goods, or whatever, and people just want to be healthier, and that takes a lot.
It underpins everything. It underpins
everything, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of I won't quote any Confucius sayings, but I think we all know the one there. So yeah.
That's really exciting, and I think it's a great vision, and certainly you seem to be on your way. We're very excited for it. So last question for you here before we wrap it up. Any influential books or podcasts that you would recommend to our listeners that you think are really interesting? Could be ML oriented, could be biotech oriented, could be at the intersection thereof, that you think people would really benefit from?
Yeah. So the way I think, I feel like I'm very like systems oriented thinker. And I feel like a lot of people I know who, that maybe they come from a finance or consulting background, or, they went to certain schools or whatever, like that's also the way they think. And it's kind of funny because I feel like so much of the success or failure of like folks in founder seats actually hinges on your ability to kind of like quiet that part of your brain and just like do the work. Like we kind of overcomplicate sometimes like all the millions of things I could do. And it's like, can I find one customer that loves what I do or loves what I'm selling? And can I find a way to reach them? And that's kind of like all you need to focus on. And so there's a couple bloggers and thinkers I know that do a good job kind of talking about that. One is Rob Snyder. I think he has a blog called Reframe. So
not to be confused with Rob Schneider.
Yes, not to be. I think it's Snyder.
The poor man's Adam Sandler. Yeah,
exactly. So he has some good stuff. And then I mean, other than that, I think like everyone kind of needs like that one or two, or maybe some people have 10, kind of like person who's aggregating all the interesting information that's like kind of going out there. Here's everything you missed. It's actually stuff you care about, because I know it's easy to try and do that in theory, but hard to do well. So I know one that's very popular that I'm a subscriber to is the Diff. And it's by Byrne. He's got a very like eloquent way of thinking. He also appeals to that kind of systems thinking, because he takes everything and tries to put like a mental model around it, which I appreciate. And at least
it sounds like something you would do if you had more time in your life, actually.
In a sense, I guess.
He thinks a lot like you do, yeah.
Maybe I'm seeking those people out. But yeah, those are two that come to mind.
That's great. Fantastic. Andrew, thank you so much for the time today and for building such an interesting company. This has been great. I really appreciate the time.
Of course. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.